We're live now. Back on. Another episode of Performance That Matters, joined by a very special guest, Mr. Charles Stull. Charles, the angry dietitian. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. In the flesh.
I don't think we've ever explained this. The angry dietitian, anyone that meets you, coolest, calmest, most collective person I've ever met, which if you know fighting and you hang around with fighters, it's always the cool, calm and collected guy you want to stay as far away from. Give us, what does it go with the angry dietitian? Inform the people.
I mean, I think obviously I have a combat sports background, fighter myself, and Muay Thai. You got to have that kill switch, right? And I guess the angry side comes out, rears its ugly head every once in a while, and people get to see it, and they're like, that's why you're called the angry dietitian. But no, it's an old fight name, so to speak.
I remember we were away years and years ago on a fight week, and a couple of the boys saw the angry dietitian come out, and
yes,
then
they remind me every week, especially this week in Sydney.
I remember they came back and they were like, yeah, don't get Charles angry. Just
poor Frank.
Yeah, don't get Charles angry. And it's like, yeah, he'll mess you up.
Oh my goodness.
Get him angry.
Yeah.
How's everything going? You're back in Sydney, UFC fight week, yet another one, traveling around. How's everything getting on?
Everything's getting on as it can. I mean, it's Wednesday. The weigh-ins are a little bit different in Sydney than what we're typically used to, which is the morning weigh-in from about 9 to 11 a.m. Right now, it's going to be a 3 to 5 p.m. weigh-in, so it actually changes the acute weight cut strategy. So given that it's a Wednesday, it's not as critical right now, as we still have a full day tomorrow to really check in with the athletes and see what their trajectory is.
Yeah, you got enough time to run across town and do a podcast.
Exactly, that's why I'm here.
Charles, last time we spoke, there's been a bit of a shift too. Mm-hmm. Director of Performance Nutrition at the UFC PI, so congrats. Well deserved too. I think there's no person who's contributed this field more than you. And you've seen the whole evolution from when the PI started. How many years ago? When did...
Yeah, the PI it's actually 8 years old now, believe it or not, which is crazy. And I'm coming up on my 7th year with UFC PI come July this year, which is also absolutely insane. And what an evolution the Performance Institute has had. I think if you could even split it up into 3 phases, and the first 2 years or so, aka the first year that I was there, it was the exploratory phase. Like, what are we even dealing with? Will anyone even come through the doors of the PI? Will we even be utilized? And it was about gathering data. So, like, what is the body composition norms within our athlete population? What problems currently exist? And the first thing that we looked at was the metabolic consequences of repeat weight cuts, and the components of that are a chronic weight loss phase, and as well as the acute weight loss phase. And from there, it was like, okay, well, now we have this data, we're sitting on it. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to help these athletes achieve their goals? And it became, okay, what deliverables do these athletes need? And to reflect back on it, we went from primarily a research and data gathering institute to now a fully systemized, deliverables-based institute where we're traveling to events. We're providing ready to heat meals for our athletes in their camps. We're providing third-party tested supplements for our athletes year-round. Recommendations around acute weight loss, traveling to events, food service, rehydration. My goodness, the list just keeps growing. And in some ways, we're victims of our own success. But I'm very proud to at least feel like I'm being utilized to my fullest degree.
Yeah, and it's been crazy to watch it too. Because I remember back in those days, back in 2017, 2018, when you guys were just starting out. And I was like, okay, what do you do?
Exactly.
And then looking at it, what it is now, the behemoth that it is now, and it's like every fighter is running to the PI to get the services that you guys offer. Just to paint the scene for the guys that don't know.
Sure.
So if there's a fighter that comes to, say, let's say Vegas, to HQ out there with you guys, what are they going through when they walk through the doors and they're coming to see you? Like, what's the process look like for a UFC fighter going to the PI?
So Dr. Roman Foman, who is our senior director of sports science, really strategized and tiered our diagnostics. I think it was a little scattered at first because we were in that exploratory phase. It's a lot more systemized now. When an athlete first comes through the door, let's say they come through one of the Dana White Contender Series, or they just get signed from another promotion, we start from our tier 1 diagnostics. It's really about profiling, understanding fat-free mass, fat mass, relative to their division, what's their weight division fit, what's their metabolism, and then once that tier 1 diagnostic is complete, we actually have our tier 2 diagnostics. And depending on the duration of which the athletes are going to be in Vegas, we can or can't run those tests. That can be the biochemical aspect, so doing blood work. And I want to preface that the blood work that we do is not monitoring, it's screening. And there is definitely a difference between the two. Screening, we have our fixed panel that we run just to look for nutritional deficiencies and things of note that can provide greater context to how an athlete is feeling, if they're under-recovered, or if they have, let's say, if our male athletes, they have poor libido, things like this that are common signs and symptoms of being a calorie deficit sport. And then another big tier 2 test that we put our athletes through is heat tolerance testing. What is their ability to buffer heat stress, tolerate heat stress, both physiologically but also psychologically, which I think is just as important, honestly. And those are our primary two tier 2 diagnostics. And using that, we accumulate with our other performance services to really create this well-rounded idea of where an athlete's at and ideally where they need to be to perform at their best, whether it's whatever weight class, whatever energy system might be deficient, etc.
What are you doing in those tier 1 things? So when you're looking at the fat-free mass, how are you doing that? How are you testing that? And then when you're saying, oh, is this a good fit for your weight division? How are you assessing that? And like you said, you've obviously got lots of data now. So how does all that work?
So the body composition test that we utilize is the DEXA. And we also use a SICA as well, with at least in the United States and within our state. There are limitations on how many times we can use a DEXA per year. So the SICA is utilized to kind of fill the gaps, especially if someone's doing their camp and we need to assess them repeatedly through a preparation cycle. But the DEXA allows us to compartmentalize and screen for bone mineral density, fat-free mass, fat mass, and because of all that data and data gathering that we've done, we have pretty robust understanding of body weight division fit. So at featherweight, for instance, 145, on average, this is how much fat-free mass our athletes have. This is how much fat mass they have. But what's also important, especially with our cyclical nature sport, is what phase of preparation they are. Because if I compared an athlete's fat mass in the off camp versus, the tail end of late fight camp, is going to be two very different stories, right? But we can understand based off of the statistical norms how an athlete fits within that division and whether or not they have an opportunity to reallocate their weight class, either higher or lower.
So you quite often getting these fringe athletes, I guess we'll call them, when they're coming in and going, Charles, I don't know, I've been signed to featherweight, but I've just been fighting at lightweight. I don't know where to go. Is this even possible? Is that a lot of it? Or is it everyone comes in and you go, hey, you know what? Let's just assess everyone and say, this is where you are in this data set. I'd
say those fringe athletes are actually not the norm. The ones that kind of are maybe a little too big for one weight class, a little too small for another. I think just the nature of, by the time you make it to the UFC, you've had enough professional fights that you've, for the most part, established your weight class. There are exceptions though, and it actually ties in heavily with nutrition and also resource availability. So think about the athlete that didn't have any sort of nutritional support, had no S&C, they're just beating everyone up in the regional scene, and they get signed, and all of a sudden you have access, you have a little more money, you got social media, all these things, and now you get yourself an S&C coach. You're hitting the weights, you're actually performing and training like a professional athlete, and you have the nutrition to back that up too. Well, there's there's a consequence to that sometimes, and that can be an accruement of fat-free mass. And it can get to the point where you start to push further and farther away from what's a sustainable weight making. And that those are situations where they can come in and say, oh my goodness, like your fat-free mass is 10% higher than the mean of your weight division, but you're much better fit for the weight division above. We give them that information. It is their choice, their decision, whether or not they, involve the matchmakers, involve their management to decide if that is feasible for them to move up. But we're all about arming the athletes with as much information as possible to make the decisions themselves.
And coming down to the biochem, the screening, and you said it's important, right? Like doing the screening. Like you said, these guys are coming in. A lot of them, when they're getting signed off the regional scene, who knows what, they're probably not working with a nutritionist or anyone really. Probably just them and the head coach from 1920s who's putting them through these rough weight cuts. What do you screen for? Are there certain things you're looking out for?
Yeah, you have your complete metabolic panel, complete blood count. Believe it or not, I find a lot of low iron in our athletes, low ferritin levels. And I imagine this probably, now that you're a super duper endurance athlete, like foot strike anemia, I can only imagine that there's probably something going on within our athletes of the micro collisions of their shins and hands and everything, that they maybe actually be predisposed to getting that form of anemia. I think without saying it over and over again, vitamin D tends to be quite low. It's technically an indoor sport. And I love to give the example of Las Vegas, because everyone thinks, oh, Las Vegas, it's sunny, your vitamin D levels must be amazing. But in the summer, it's like 114 degrees Fahrenheit, which I believe that's like almost close to 50 degrees Celsius. So you're not outside. And then in the winter, it's cold. So basically you get no sun living in Vegas, and your vitamin D levels are low. And then, of course, we also look at our sex hormones, which is actually quite a hot topic within, believe it or not, our male athletes right now. But I think it's a chronic issue that our athletes have particularly low testosterone levels relative to what you would think. These are, gladiators. They should have, raging high testosterone, but ultimately the calorie deficit nature, the high training load, it's maladaptive for having high testosterone levels.
And last part of that, the heat tolerance, that's probably not something that when you say that as part of an assessment, hey, look, fat-free mass makes sense. We're a weight category sport here.
Sure.
Let's check out our biomarkers. Yeah, let's see if there's been some damage here. Heat tolerance, how does that fit in?
So heat tolerance, it started from, well, we would have to take it way back. And maybe this even loops back to kind of you spearheading the concept of heat acclimation within combat sports. Honestly, I think you were probably the largest voice in the combat sports field when it came to heat acclimation, and really sort of at least popularizing it and creating a protocol around it. Fast forward to today, it's definitely a more well-known practice, but I'd still think within the athletes that we've dealt with, there are still gaps in some of their knowledge. Is the thermal impulse enough to actually elicit those heat adaptations? Is the duration long enough? And the intensity? Are there too many gaps? Is there too much decay between sessions? All these variables were just sort of unknowns. So in order to prescribe heat acclimation, you had to test an athlete's ability to buffer heat. And we devised a protocol that incorporates a active component as well as passive. Now, we could have probably done all active or all passive, but I think there are advantages to doing that split model. The active component is a certain amount of watts per kilo in a bike under certain humidity and certain ambient room temperature. So 40 degrees Celsius and 39 to 40% humidity, right? Those are the fixed variables, followed by a passive heat exposure in a hot tub. That's about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll have to convert the numbers back and forth in my head. I know I'm splitting them up. But just as important as to see how high your core body temperature climbs to, it's just as important for the cooling phase to see how long it takes for your core body temperature to come back down. And it's been so fascinating and eye-opening to look at each individual athlete and see a completely different curve. And it changes too. Let's say an athlete's a habitual sauna user at home, and they have a completely different curve where it almost takes a full hour before their core body temperature starts to climb to 103 degrees Fahrenheit, which is beginning to get to the overheating phase. Well, that's fantastic. That indicates to me that you have the capacity to buffer that heat stress. Versus we have some athletes that their core body temperature starts climbing even in the aerobic phase, right? And that gives us information on how to prescribe where they are in their heat acclimation preparation, but also gives us some ideas around how they can perhaps approach their acute weight cut. And it was really a beautiful way of tying it all together, the preparatory phase into the weight cut.
Yeah, the heat acclimation stuff's interesting, right? Because the way I always used to preface it is you go train every single day, you do your skills, and then you eat, and then you do your recovery.
Yep.
And everyone knows that. But then it's almost like you get to the weight cut, and it's not until you're at the weight cut and you go, oh, shoot, well, I've got to cut weight, I've got to do it. And it's like, well, you spar every week to get ready for the fight. Why are we not doing anything for this weight cut?
Yes.
And it's just such an interesting combo. Can you expand on that though, Charles? You said capacity to buffer heat stress. Why is that important for a fighter who does have to do this weight cutting, whether it be in a sauna or a bath, they put in the sweats on? Capacity to buffer heat stress, why is that important?
I think so. So the point and the physiological and psychological changes that one gets and occurs through heat acclimation, I think you could sort of compartmentalize them into 3 buckets. And I want to preface the first one is the psychological benefits. And I think that's actually a massive component of the habitualization process is I've done this before, I can do it. It hasn't been 6 months since I've sat in a sauna. It hasn't been 6 months since I sat in a hot tub, right? I did this 3 days ago or 1 week ago, what have you. And that can start to occur with even 2 sessions. There's another component, which is the cardiovascular side. Those who've been in a really hot room, trained in a really hot room, or have actually done an acute weight cut, you can feel the pounding of your heart just in your skull, right? And that's your cardiovascular system trying to manage the reduction in plasma volume, has to maintain that blood pressure. So there's immense cardiac advantages, adaptations, and of course there's the changes in sweat rate as well as sweat composition. I think both are incredibly important. The increases in sweat rate and sweat magnitude are wonderful, right? We want our athletes to be very sweaty, but we also want them to have a sweat composition that's not very high in sodium, because why that's important for our athletes is to avoid hyponatremia, where sodium levels may drop, and so you can buffer you can buffer heat better by having a larger total body water, larger plasma volume through heat acclimation.
So you've done all this testing, Charles. Come in, full suite of testing, body composition, biochem. You've sat them down and gone, okay, this is your protocol, individualized protocol about how you can handle heat. We're going to use that. What do you do with all that info? How do you package all that info and then go, okay, here's your fight camp deal. Here we go. This is what it is. How do you put all that together?
Good question. It comes down to, first, once you have their profile, you can incorporate the decay rate at which core body temperature comes back down. And in doing so, it comes down to rest periods. And you're not only habitualizing them to doing and tolerating the heat, but also teaching them the importance of rest periods during heat acclimation, which eventually will plant seeds for the acute weight cut as well. And we can get more into rest periods and weight cutting itself in just a bit, but ultimately you really need your core body temperature to be above 38.5 degrees Celsius to occur heat adaptations. You don't need to get your core body temperature to 42 degrees Celsius, right? Goodness gracious. Yeah. So just if you can incorporate the rest periods, you can actually keep someone for up to an hour just tickling the line of that 38.5 degrees Celsius core body temperature, occurring heat adaptations without overheating them, which is actually, I would argue, and you've prefaced this a lot too in your with your athletes and publicly, that overheating is perhaps even more detrimental than dehydration itself. But yeah, it comes down to those rest periods and incorporating them in and breaking up the thermal impulse of the heat stress.
And that's something that you're just going to then prescribe and say, hey, you know what? You've got 8 weeks here in this camp.
Yep.
This is your profile.
Yep.
We've come up with these rest periods based on how your body changes as you're exposed to the heat. This is what we think is best for you. So when you get to that weight cut, it's going to be the best time possible, quote unquote, for your body.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. How do you then put this in together into like a nutrition plan? If they're coming in and they're going, okay, we've got all this info. I know where my fat composition is at. I know how much I need to lose. I'm good. You screen me. I'm okay. We've got this plan for my heat acclimation so the weight cut doesn't completely suck.
Yeah.
What's the next step if you're going, I'm going, hey, Charles, like what happens with my food? How do you plan all that? And how does this all come together within the PI?
So we have sort of, you can say, a buffet of services that we offer, and an athlete reaches out and say, hey, let's say ideally, I have a fight in 8 weeks.
Ideally.
And we'll get into that in just a bit too. I have a fight in 8 weeks. I am responsible, and I am 17% over my weight class. Not terrible, not bad. Which means I essentially need to lose about 1% body mass a week. All right, that's for males, very sustainable, a chronic weight loss. We can prescribe through our programming software that can be sent directly to your phone. We use Notemeal. It's a TeamWorks platform, programming. And I think a flaw that sometimes practitioners run into is they write these really beautiful programs, but it's very hard to follow. To make your life even easier, we'll also send you the food that follows that program. So we can make your life very easy. In addition to that, the supplements to fill the gaps, and then as a complete package, that heat acclimation protocol that you really can initiate between that 3 to 4 weeks prior to fight week.
Yeah. And within that plan that you're writing them, are you then looking at like training, nutrition, things like that, and then going, hey, look what you're training, you're doing any periodization? How do you guys go about all that?
We've gone through cycles in nutrient periodization, and I think different athletes respond differently to different programming. We used to be of the mindset that we periodize carbohydrates with high carbohydrate on high training load days. We would sleep low, so sleep with low glycogen to prepare for a low intensity training day. And ultimately, the chaotic nature of MMA, it is nearly impossible to create an adherence to nutrition periodization that is that complex. And ultimately, without oversimplifying it, it really does come down to calorie deficit, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to. So if I keep calorie neutrality all the way through the week, net calories might be higher on a rest day, but in a negative energy balance on the training days, and ultimately, cumulatively, it's a net negative energy balance. You're going to lose body mass. You're going to lose body fat, and that's the approach. It's a much more simplified model. If an athlete reports being under-recovered, hey, I got 2 really hard back-to-back days, my glycogen status is too low going into that second day, fine. We'll make adjustments, but as a standalone protocol, it's pretty standard through the week.
Yeah. Is there anything you're trying to aim for when it comes to like around training, just to say, hey, look, because like you said, it's chaotic, but at the end of the day, and this is a combo I always have with people, it's like, yeah, there's hard, easy, moderate session. They're all pretty hard.
They're all pretty hard.
Wrestling's hard. Hitting pads is hard. If you're going live rounds, it's hard. And even when you're drilling and it starts easy, usually ends hard. Like the burn and the intensity for most MMA guys, it's pretty high, right? Like so the turnover is going to be pretty similar between when you're looking at it. It's going to be quite big. Do you guys consider that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we moved away from over periodizing carbohydrates to just having carbohydrate availability all the time. And ultimately, if you care about fat oxidation and all those other variables, at the end of the day, it's a calorie deficit sport, which means the energy needs to come from somewhere because I'm technically not giving you enough calories. So the energy is going to come from adipose tissue. So you are going to still contribute fat to your net energy expenditure. So my approach is, hey, I want to give you the fuel to execute the training that you need to accomplish. And this is a very glycolytic sport. Try nose breathing while you're drilling. It's not very easy. In fact, you probably can't, that just goes to show that the aerobic energy system probably can't meet all of your energy demands, and you will have to tap into your glycolytic energy systems, aka carbohydrates need to be available if you want to execute that energy intensity. And ultimately, we throw a lot of carbs at them.
What are some of the types of carbs that you get in them? Like, do you have got at the PI, is there like set things that you're like, hey, just grab one of these on the way to training, or like do you send it out in the packs or things like that? Or is there set carbs that you're like, oh man, I love this as like a little fueling pack for MMA fighters?
Yeah, so I mean, I do have a preference for starchy carbohydrates coming from meals. There's micronutrients that are associated with that, what have you. But from a convenience factor, maltodextrins are a fantastic carbohydrate options that I like to incorporate in our athletes' intra and pre-training regimen. You can find things that athletes have a preference for, works for their lifestyle. Vitargo is a fantastic carbohydrate that I like to utilize. And ultimately, you could even argue that an ORS has carbohydrates in it, which can absolutely meet some of the exogenous carbohydrates to execute a training session of a duration that a typical MMA athlete would utilize.
That's an important point. Let's talk about that and just expand on it quickly. The duration that a typical MMA fighter. Explain that.
I think maybe it's a misconception. I don't know. Maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but an MMA training practice, the intense component of it is probably not lasting more than an hour. If I'm completely honest, there's a whole warm up phase, and then you have your maybe your hard rounds, and you have about 30 minutes of chit chat at the end. And ultimately, I'd say that the carbohydrate availability just needs to be periodized and available for that 1 hour burst of training before there's a refractory recovery period where you can resynthesize your muscle glycogen and prepare for the next session. I don't think the durations are like, if you ask an athlete how many hours a day they train, they'll probably tell you something like 6. But if you actually wore some technology like a first beat or something that's actually monitoring the actual intensity, it's kind of very much like how I described, very, very casual warm up, very intense hour, and then just chit chat. So that 3 hours was just 1 hour.
It's important because we were talking off air. It's a glycolytic sport. No one's arguing that. Very, very glycolytic. Anyone's done any combat sports, it's glycolytic and it's hard, it's tough. You do need carbs.
Yep.
The thing is, you're losing weight. Like, even if we're saying here 1% per week, you've got to be in a deficit. You're constrained. And if we're doing everything right with how we're structuring our macros, we're not feeling like we're running an ultra marathon. There's no way that you're eating 10 to 12 grams per kilo. It's not possible, right? So it's like, even though we say and we appreciate, this is a glycolytic sport, these carbs are important, I would not say that MMA guys are high carb athletes. Not a chance.
I mean, and for athletes that are in a weight descent, you'd be lucky if they're consuming 4 grams per kilo, which, coming from the endurance sports, right, like of the 8 to 12 grams per kilo per day, which is classified as a high carbs allotment. Our sport isn't getting a huge amount of carbohydrates. And 4 grams per kilo, you're asking a lot for an athlete to be compliant with that. A lot of times it tickles down to probably about 3 grams per kilo, and even less going into fight week.
Yeah, and you know that just from practicing. I think there's 3 case studies where you can look at that. And I remember going through these case studies, and I think the lowest was 3 grams.
Yeah.
I think the next one was 3.5, and then the highest was like 4.5 or something. And you're like, it's not that much. And when you break it down, it's really not that much for a highly glycolytic sport. But it comes back to this point, right? Like you're saying, you need to be smart with how you're getting these carbs in, because yeah, you might have really big sessions, not so big sessions, but at the end of the day, you don't have that many carbs. So make sure you've got them on board. The carbs you do have them on board. So when you get to this training, you're not completely dying.
Yep, 100%. 100%.
Yeah. Let's talk about fight week. Fight week is chaotic for you guys. I always sit back and I go, man, how lucky am I? I think fight week's chaotic for me. I go away with 1, maybe 2 if I'm really stretching myself.
Perth, you had quite a few.
Yeah, every now and then we get a few in there, but I get to bring a whole team. But then I look at you guys, I'm like, how the hell is Charles looking after literally 20 plus athletes, all with their own different weight descents? I think the craziest part of it, some of them, that's your first contact point. They're just coming into the fight week and you're going, hey, where you at? And they're just throwing this number at you and you're going, okay, cool. I've got to come up with this whole plan. How does this work? Like, what is this system that the PI has developed? Because I've seen it evolve so much over the years and the team has just grown, not only just the dietitians, the chefs, everyone's involved. Talk to us about this fight week when athletes come in, they check in with you, then what's the process look like from there?
I mean, we can start from day one because that's probably like a story that's worth sharing to just see how far we've come. When we first started, we didn't even really have a hotel kitchen. Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. The food service operation, we had no distributors, so we'd have to go to the grocery store to buy everything. We didn't have the systems. We didn't have the systems in place. And I can just remember, 2019 running around with hard-boiled eggs, with, some olive oil and whatnot to increase the fat calories, running around, texting athletes where they were. There was just no system. We had no office. We had no hub of which to distribute food. And to see where we've grown and where we've come from, I actually have to give a lot of credit to Dan Marquette on my team. He lives in the world of Excel. Like if there was a way to put him in the matrix, he would be very happy there. This guy has revolutionized our systems where we're forecasting events, problem solving, checklists 8, sometimes 12 weeks in advance of an event. We're already onboarding events that we will have in May right now. That's going on organically based off of your assignment. We have all these checklists from like, who's our food distributor? Is it a different country? Do we have to air freight all of our supplies? Is it a truck? Is it in Vegas? We have all these variables that need to be identified way in advance about forecasting. He's done an amazing job of systemizing that. In addition, the athlete screening process used to be, the odd text, hey, how's it going? What's your weight at? And then, be like, crap, you're 12% over. We have to make weight in 7 days. Now it's much more of an onboarding screening tool, like a Google questionnaire, Google survey, but it provides us information around what's your heat acclimation session. And we use language that's relatable to athletes. How many times have you done this? I have no idea is also an option on the survey. How many carbohydrates are you having? This many grams? I have no idea. That's also an option. And at least it gives us an idea of our athletes' education. But at the same time, it paints a much better picture of their nutritional status. All of this accumulates into a fantastic Excel sheet that we can use and synthesize into our nutrition prescription and programming based off of allergies, food preferences, etc. That all sounds great, but at the end of the day, it's all numbers. The next big machine that has just grown leaps and bounds is the culinary scene, which is spearheaded by Steve Petrie, our executive chef. He has been able to take arguably very challenging food to enjoy, and so for everyone's awareness, we have to elicit acute weight loss. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that make food taste good, require sodium and salt. It's just part of our DNA. Well, because we need to reduce our water retention, we don't get to play with salt leading into weigh-ins, and that can create a lot of poor palatability. So he's been able to incorporate textures, utilize stevias and sweeteners to recreate the things that we have nostalgia for, things we miss through fight camp. Like our fight camp snack this week is a chocolate cheesecake with a chocolate ganache on top, and with a pistachio crumble. My goodness,
I'm gonna
fight
come
week,
get some.
yeah, fight week. Are you kidding me? And he's just done an amazing job. But at the end of the day, he has to take that nutrition prescription and make it into food, and that is truly an art. And he would say the most important character of being a UFC PI chef is adaptability, because you get off a plane, you're in Abu Dhabi, you gotta figure it out. And him and his team of 4 now have done an incredible job of systemizing, as I keep saying, the food service component of our fight week deliverable.
The food component is wild, and I've seen that evolution. I remember back in the day before you guys even had a kitchen, and you're kind of just running around, and it's just like, it's makeshift everything.
Yep.
It still work, like don't get me wrong, you got it out, but then seeing how that's come, and then when Steve's come in, and the food that he puts out, like I just look at it and I'm like, oh my God. Like I've oftentimes, when my fighters have come in, they're bringing me in, they're paying me to come in, I'll just get the food from you guys and I'll eat it. I'll just take the food and I'll cook for them, and I just go, I'm going to eat your 100%. Food stuff for you guys.
I
hope
you salt it though.
Yeah, definitely. A little bit of salt. Yeah. But it's awesome. What about, say, okay, that's the food. These guys are dropping. What's the process look like then? Because obviously they're cutting weight, like you said. Sure. You're doing the things where we got low sodium, low carbs, low fiber. We're doing all those things. We've changed it. Like you said, these guys have dropped 1% per week, often 17% weight over. They're coming into fight week. I guess this is a good segue. Are they coming in at 10%? We often say this number, right? Where we go, hey, 10% is pretty safe. And then we're dropping each day. Is that what you're seeing when these guys are coming? You got a lot of years of data now.
Yeah. So I guess that's something I forgot to mention. Not only is it important to have all the information about nutritional status, et cetera, what's equally important is understanding the individuality around what each athlete tends to arrive at, how much each individual athlete tends to cut, and having your standard deviation and norms. As I mentioned, there's only 2 of us that travel, 2 dietitians that travel to each fight card. It's very hard to divvy up time and prioritize time amongst sometimes 26, sometimes 30 athletes on a fight card. So being able to flag and designate time, energy, availability, and resources to an athlete that we potentially see increased risk is just as important as having all the systems to actually provide a deliverable. So coming back to standard deviations and norms around fight week, as it stands right now, we actually published a paper, I think now it's probably 2 years ago, around average arrival weights, acute weight cuts, and regains. That number has shifted a little bit. I believe the statistical average for a Tuesday arrival, so 3 days from the weigh-ins, is 7.9% now. The acute weight cut is closer to 5.5%. So Thursday to Friday, the water cut is on average 5.5%. And the weight regain is about 10.9% now. And there's variations on that regain if you dive into it between a fight night or pay-per-view and where the card is relative to, from weigh-ins relative to the fight time. For instance, if you have an event on the East Coast, the event is much later. Sometimes the main card starts at 10, so your main event might not fight till 1 a.m. Well, that just gives you a lot more time to, smash an extra, 100 grams of carbohydrates and food and fluids compared to Perth, where we had a maximum of 24 hours between weigh-ins and fight time, and the regains were less, but on average, 10.9%.
Do you see that as a problem, Charles? Because that's a big discussion, right? Where people go, weight cutting is dangerous, which is a topic I want to bring up, and if you have thoughts about that. But that change from weigh-ins to when these guys compete, do you see that as a problem that, hey, they're getting 24 hours, that might not be as good as 36 hours, or if they get 50 hours? What are your thoughts around that?
So there's probably several things to attack there. In terms of the weigh-in window, whether I think the argument is always, well, it should just be same day weigh-in. I think our athletes are always going to push the envelope. And at least if you have a 24-hour recovery period, I can more confidently assure that an athlete is better recovered, given that the magnitude of the weight cut may not actually change, whether it was a same day weigh-in or a day after weigh-in. And I think we've gone back and forth on this too. And I think you probably share some similar thoughts, but at the end of the day, I think our athletes are just they're going to cut weight. The magnitude is going to be the same. So we might as well give them an adequate recovery window that allows them to facilitate glycogen repletion and fluid status so they can actually perform. I would be fascinated to know the statistics around fight performance if we did a same day weigh-in because of how poor the fluid status and glycogen would be. Maybe we just get like nothing but decisions and we get the first athlete that actually had to tap out because of fatigue. But with regards to weight cutting, and you mentioned it being dangerous. Well, absolutely. By default, weight cutting is increasing the risk of adverse health outcomes. You are putting an athlete under increased heat stress. You're manipulating electrolyte status as well as total fluid volume. You're creating a pretty significant calorie deficit at times when necessary, and it absolutely can be negative for health consequences. But what I think we've done, and you can even tell with those numbers of 5.5% acute weight loss, that magnitude of water weight loss, when compared to, for instance, elite endurance athletes, where some of them may even lose up to 12% body mass from the start to the end of their race, goes to show that the magnitude of sweat losses may not actually be as high as social media may portray. I do think there's this certain mystery behind weight cuts that kind of convolutes the message. For starters, I think people, and the athletes too, when they describe it, they don't differentiate what a weight cut means. So weight cutting to the general public might be the weight of an athlete at the beginning of camp to when they get on the scale. Well, of course, it's going to be sometimes 30 pounds. That doesn't mean they lost 30 pounds in one day. Absolutely not. And the statistics show that it's on average 5.5%. But because there is this mystery behind weight cutting, because athletes oftentimes don't want to be very public about their weight cuts because they are compromised. It's an intimate setting that you want to be close with your team and those you trust, and you want it to be somewhat closed off. Because of that mystery behind the weight cut, not everyone gets to really see and understand what goes on. And I will say, once again, you've done a fantastic job of demystifying what goes on behind the scenes of weight cuts through a lot of the work that you've done with your athletes.
Yeah, that's the thing. And this is a question I'd love to ask you because I get asked it all the time. And it's simple. People just say, well, is it dangerous? Would you say weight cutting is safe? And you and I have gone back and forth on this. And my answer, yeah, if you do it properly, it is safe.
If you do it properly, sustainably, at the magnitudes that are repeatable, it can absolutely be done time and time again. But inherently, what I mean, the philosophy of weight cutting can be negative towards health outcomes.
And when we're saying that, let's hammer this point home. Mm-hmm. When you're saying that, within the magnitudes of what we know are safe, you've got all the data. There's no one on planet Earth that has more weight cut data at their fingertips than you right now. What are those parameters and these safety nets, let's call them, that make weight cutting safe?
You could sort of reverse the question and say, what happens when a weight cut goes wrong? So it can be, the simplest way of looking at it is the magnitude of weight at which you have to cut is too great. And that might be because you have this misconception that being the larger athlete cutting the most amount of weight may have an improvement in your ability to win. which it doesn't, and we can get into that in just a bit too. So that they're simply cutting too much because, let's say it was a late notice fight, they were underprepared, and their acute weight cut was much larger than is sustainable for them. It can be because the thermal impulse which they put their body through was simply too great, because they didn't account for ambient room temperature, intensity of the session, and how hot the environmental stressors are. It can be not having enough heat acclimation that's weaved in, and just not having a plan. And that all sounds good and dandy on paper, but what it actually looks like in the conversations that I have with the athletes is, for instance, when a coach will say to them, "Well, we're going to hit mitts, but I don't want you to hit too hard to break a sweat." And to me, immediately I'm like, okay, what intensity is that? Hit mitts, but not too hard. Like, what does that even mean? It's the athlete that says, how hot should the bathtub be? Oh, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, as hot as I can take it. Right? That's a box ticked for setting yourself up for failure. And it can also be an athlete, for instance, that uses an exercise modality to elicit acute weight loss that they never prepared their body for. So it's Charles, my legs feel like shit after this weight cut, and I'm saying, okay, well, how did you cut the weight? Well, I ran on a treadmill until I made weight. Oh yeah, how much running did you do in camp? None. Okay, well, you just did 2 or 3 hours of running that you never prepared for in sweats, and no wonder why you set yourself up for failure. So that's what it kind of looks like in practice.
So if we're going to put numbers to it and just summarize it, we can kind of say, okay, look, 72 hours out, if you're just under 8%, that seems to be within a normal amount.
Yes.
If you're getting ready to cut weight, that is, we're going to get in the bathtub or the sauna or do whatever to sweat it out.
Yep.
5.5% seems to be normal.
Yep.
If we've got the regain data that says, hey, it's about 10.9% that they come, we can probably assume, say at the beginning of the week, a couple days before this initial check here, they're roundabout there.
Around about there, I would say, just because we talked about this a little bit earlier around glycogen status and how much carbs our athletes are actually ingesting every day. I think they're probably around that 10% mark the week prior, but perhaps their glycogen status is a little bit lower than it probably is come fight day, just because they're probably ingesting less than 4 grams per kilo compared to post weigh-in where they're getting 8 to 12, what they should be getting. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I think 10%, 10 days out is realistic. But it is important to preface the nutritional status at which I am 10% out. I haven't followed a ketogenic diet for a month. I haven't omitted every form of electrolyte. I haven't even perhaps dry fasted. Oh, sorry, not dry fasted. I've fasted for 3 days. So I've essentially cleared my gut contents. They haven't, if they've done that and they're 10% over, I don't have much to work with.
Yeah. So it's coming in, like you said, having the plan and executing the plan. So when we're saying 10% out, 10 days out, that's 10% of a body we know we can cut weight with. Yes. Not 10% of a body that's already dehydrated, already glycogen depleted.
Yep.
You haven't even looked at salt for 2 days. Mm-hmm. You've probably ran in sweats before you got on the plane, already done. That's 10% we can work with. And then you're saying, okay, everything else needs to be planned too. You can't be in an environment which is too hot. You can't be in an environment where you're doing too much, say you're trying to cut too much weight too soon. There's no plan there. You can't have no structure when you're going into this. And you've got to do things that you've practiced, like you said, with this heat acclimation. There's got to be some type of modality and structure that you've had coming in. If we can line all of these things up, we can hit these numbers, we can have a plan, we can sit there and go, we know what parameters we want in terms of temperature, the rest breaks, like you said, managing the overheating. We can pretty confidently say, yeah, the human body and an athlete going through this can do this very safely.
Absolutely.
I like that because it's important, because even coming back here, right, you always hear people say, oh, just do same day weigh-ins. It would be so much less dangerous. And you go, I don't think it's not. I do not think that's the case, because MMA fighters are going to cut regardless.
They're absolutely going to cut regardless. And you're just going to have people punching themselves in the brain that hasn't been hydrated.
Yeah. And this is the thing. I was even having this conversation with a fighter today, and they was telling me, hey, last time when I fought here, it was the 24-hour weigh-ins. And he goes, man, the difference that 12 hours makes is insane. He goes, oh man, my legs just felt heavy. I could tell I wasn't dehydrated. He's like, I did everything right. I followed what Charles did and told me to do. But it's just purely a time thing, right? Like you just physically, no matter what you do, when you're orally drinking it, it's just a time thing. The more time we have there, the better. Same day weigh-ins, the least amount of time.
The least amount.
The least amount of time.
Absolutely.
Can we touch back on this weight regain data?
Sure.
Let's circle back to that, because that's an interesting convo as well. Like you said, the rationale, if I'm going to cut weight, I'm going to be the bigger dude. I'm going to smash this dude.
Yep.
Where are we at with that?
So I'm going to give a lot of people shout outs, because what you see here is just really the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that no one gets to see. And so many people that dedicate their lives to moving the needle of performance forward behind the scenes that don't get much light. Brett, he's a sports scientist that works under Dr. Roman Foman. He was gracious enough to really help me conceptualize and process all of this data that we had around Fight Week. And I think it's an evolving project, and we are going to publish it. I hope this year. But I think he may have answered the question, is bigger better, with regards to fighting. And when it comes to that, there's some papers that exist right now. I know CSAC has done some work around looking at win-loss ratio relative to weight comparing athletes that go into the ring or octagon, etc. And I have to be specific and say ring or octagon because they accumulated many different sports and many different competition levels. So what I can confidently say with an elite MMA athletes that fight at the UFC, the average arrival weight on a Tuesday for athletes that won was 7.9%. The average for athletes that lost was 8%. So once again, that's a very small difference. The acute weight cut for athletes that won was 5.4%. The athletes that had an acute weight cut on Thursday that lost was 5.5%. And then in terms of the weight regain, the athletes that won were 10.9%, and the athletes that lost were 10.8%. So what does that tell you? That tells you, and granted, this isn't just an N of 10. This is an N of 100. This is an N of 1,000. And this includes this means we have to data match and have the data points for every single arrival weight, weight cut, and regain in order to data match these guys. So that's 1,000 data sets. And at the end of the day, being the larger athlete or being the smaller athlete has nothing to do with win-loss.
So we can say, from the years of data that the UFC PI has collected on that, collecting data from 72 hours out, collecting data from how much they're cutting 24 hours out, then collecting data from how much they regain from 24 hours after and right before they go in, so their weight regain data, we can pretty confidently say bigger is not better.
Correct.
That's some groundbreaking stuff there. I like that though. Because isn't it, how many times, and I guess now people are probably a bit more educated about it.
Yep.
I know when I started out here, that was the narrative.
Yeah.
Hey man, how much can I cut? And you're like, what do you mean? They just go, man, I just want to cut as much as possible. I don't think that's good. I don't care. I want to cut as much so I can put as much back on. And just breaking through that barrier with education is difficult. It's difficult to break that mindset of, oh, I've got to be bigger. And it's like, well, no, man. I know like maybe like logically it kind of makes sense, right? And anyone that's trained, if you've had someone sit on you, if you've done an open weight jiu-jitsu, you get it. But it's like, you get it, but it doesn't really work like that.
We've really hit an equilibrium within, once again, this sport. Not this sport, this organization of elite MMA athletes. And who knows, maybe like we have a hand in that because we're guiding them towards that weight descent. But essentially, as the data shows, weight regain being larger, the smaller athlete in the octagon doesn't change your win-loss outcome. What will be fascinating, and I think, once this paper comes out and there's more discussions, all the fight metric data can start to be layered onto the fight out, the arrival weights, etc. Maybe the athlete that was larger took more headshots. Maybe the athlete that regained the most covered less distance in the octagon. Who knows? There's a whole world that we can start to dive into, but at least I know, like, my contribution to the sport, so to speak, is I think finally being able to answer that, regaining the most amount of weight more than your opponent doesn't improve your win outcome.
Yeah, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly.
Now, the PI, Charles, was set up to prevent one thing, and that's weight misses, right?
Yep.
It was set up to stop the amount of weight misses and keep the athletes safe.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any data? Have you guys been collecting that? Because it does happen. And like you said, you could have the best protocol systems. Things happen. Like It happens with us on the regional scene. What's the data say when it comes to weight misses? Have you guys been looking at that, collecting that as well?
Yeah, so we definitely have, and there's a bunch of even public record in terms of weight miss percentages, et cetera. And I would say on average, it hovers around 3% of our athletes miss weight per year. But trying to demystify and figure out where those weight miss probabilities come from, and once again, this goes back to our risk status, where we're trying to better identify athletes that we should prioritize our time and efforts on fight week to make sure their health and safety is being looked after. We were trying to look for risk variables, magnitude of weight above your weight class is, of course, one of them. But what we're starting to figure out is, and it makes sense when you think about it, it's when you accept the fight relative to your fight date. And the risk of weight miss doubles when you take a fight for less than 4 weeks. And that's incredibly important for us as practitioners to be like, okay, well, we know that this was a late notice fight. This athlete may be nutritionally very depleted. They may have followed the 1 month no carbohydrates. They may have followed the 1 month no sodium. They may have done the 3-day fast just to do their very best to elicit some weight loss. Now that sets them up, unfortunately, for failure in terms of being able to manipulate acute weight loss. But at least we know that, and we can better safeguard that athlete's health and safety, and resource them to execute their cut to their best ability, and then also help them recover to compete in the octagon.
So we're saying then that if you take a fight less than 4 weeks out,
mm-hmm.
your chances of missing weight are doubled.
Yes.
Wow. What is your role then with that athlete? Is it then, okay, well, we know the chance of you missing is pretty high. What's your role? Is it, okay, we need to get you to weight at all costs? Or is it more of a buffer? I want to just keep you safe and let's get you within a limit, which I'm sure the big bosses at the UFC don't love. But at the end of the day, you and I, we're health professionals. As much as we want to say we're weight cut professionals, our job is to keep people healthy. So where do you sit with that if you've got this guy that you go, hey, I know there's a good chance you're going to miss, but it's my job to help you get there? What do you do?
At the end of the day, we balance a tightrope of we're trying to get you to your weight, but I also want to look after your health and safety. And the last thing that we want is an athlete to push their body beyond the point of no return. Now that can, in the best case scenario is the athlete just says, I can't cut anymore. The fight is off because something negative happened. The worst that it can be is an athlete dies. So our job is to sort of embed ourselves within that acute weight cut to be an all-seeing eye and a guide towards making sure that they're executing acute weight loss, heat stress, all these variables in a way that, maximizes the probability of their success of getting to weight. But if push comes to shove, we build the trust with the athlete and coaches to involve our UFC medical team to assess them. And ultimately, through our chief medical officer, decide if this athlete can continue or not. And if they can't, that's the athlete's prerogative. We get them to weigh-ins, we rehydrate them, we monitor them because they may have poor ability to tolerate oral rehydration. And once they're past that acute rehydration phase and they can graduate to, focusing on glycogen resynthesis, we can pass them off and they can go on their own way.
What's the process then? If you're allowed to talk about it, because I know this is a taboo topic, right? Where it's like, but it's a real risk. Like, as much as you want to dance around it, people have died cutting weight, and it's a real risk, right? And it's this weird in between where, it should probably be a medical professional's job, but you and I are the guys that are the ones in there, so we need to have some type of, what are some things that you're looking at? Say you've got this high risk guy coming in, and like, okay, what's the in between here between, okay, this weight cut's gone bad, I need to involve the medical officer and get someone in to assess. What's this part over here look like?
So I think what even precedes that is that trust building process. And I think at this point, unless it's a very niche team that, comes from the mountains from somewhere and has never even seen a single UFC staff, we've built this brand of trust with our athletes and expertise where they can lean on us and trust us. And a lot of coaches, when they have their new signee come in, they're very upfront with us in terms of their nutritional status, what it has required for them to get to this point that where they're standing in front of us right now. And we're very candid and realistic about where they need to be, where they need to get to. And so there's that trust process first, and then guiding them through that acute weight cut as well. But ultimately, we rely heavily on Dr. Heather Linden and her sports medicine team within the Performance Institute to be the guidance around and objective measures of health and wellness for athletes, whether it's blood pressure. I can't speak on all the tests that they do as outside of my scope of practice, but at the end of the day, as you mentioned too, if you could describe what we do, nutrition is a big component of it, but we're like a Swiss Army knife. I almost think a weight cut is the manifestation of every performance service in that moment. It's the nutritional status. It's the sports medicine managing orthostatic hypotension. It's the S&C coach and the intensity at which the athlete is able to execute. It's the sports scientist and the recovery. It's the psychologist and whether that athlete can tolerate that and keep pushing forward through the adversity. All of that falls onto our lap at times. That's just a day in the life of a dietitian at the UFC.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, right? Because it happened, but it's something you need to talk about.
Yeah.
And this is why this is important, right? And I think because people tend to catastrophize everything.
Yeah.
And always when we talk about weight cutting, it's bad. People have died doing it. Yeah, don't get me wrong. It can be bad. There's a lot of potential for it to be bad. But you got to remember, we're in a sport where people voluntarily get into a cage, they lock it, and we punch and kick and choke each other until we're unconscious.
Yes.
So it's a pretty dangerous sport.
Sure.
This is a dangerous practice. But like we're saying, if you can follow these rules, and you can follow these guidelines, you're getting probably the most qualified person in the world who can say this, to say, hey, this is a safe practice. Not only is it safe, but it can be done for the length of someone's career.
That they wish to.
If they wish to do it. And are we saying that these guys can repeatedly cut weight and then come out on the other side and say, hey, look, you're pretty good at the end of this? Or do you have any personal theories or philosophies about that? If they follow this, are they good when they retire and they finish? Or is it like, hey, man, you're probably going to have some metabolic issues, something's going on. Where are you at with that?
I think physiologically, it's very recoverable if all those things are taken into account. And I say physiologically, I think the elephant in the room is the psychology piece. And I would argue that's probably one thing that we perhaps don't invest enough time in is the conversation around time after sport. And there have been athletes that have been very vocal, and actually Claudia Gadelha, who was part of the UFC PI team, and she's now with UFC Fight Pass. She was very open around the psychological trauma of being done as an athlete. Your identity is changed forever. there's that whole component, which, needs management, I think. And then more on the dietitian realm, I think you've published some research around the prevalence of disordered eating patterns in MMA athletes. And I thought, I forget what it was specifically, but I believe it was 4 out of 5. Yeah. Now, that's while it's being monitored, managed, you have this ultimate goal of needing to make weight and perform, and that you have that. But once you're done with sport, that motivating factor of dietary compliance is gone. So all you're left with is the damage psychologically and disordered eating. And it's a journey. And I can attest to it. It was a journey for me, and maybe it was a journey for you as well, of normalizing and rekindling your satiety cues, which you oftentimes turn off during your career, at least when you're in camp. I think that whole component is a conversation that probably needs to be had. And I think we'll learn more about the psychological toll. But once again, physiologically, if everyone's following these variables, I am very confident in saying that you will not leave the sport physiologically compromised from weight making.
I think that's a pretty good spot to wrap that up, Charles. But before we finish up, I have 2 questions. And I spring this on you, and I sent you questions ahead of time, and I didn't send you these 2. Everyone gets them though, so don't worry. First one, and this is a tough one, might not seem too tough, but when I got asked this, it really made me sit back and go, interesting. I'll preface this. I was running with one of my buddies. I say this every episode, fighter jet pilot. And he asked me, Geordie, you work with all these athletes, do all these cool things. How do you define performance? I thought, what a great question. What a very interesting question. Take a minute because it's tough, but how do you define it? What's your definition of performance?
Performance for me, like metaphorically, or does it have to be
performance in general? Because I got another one for you.
Well, I mean, performance is the action or actions of moving towards or accomplishing a goal, a task. And for every goal that you have, there's a whole ecosystem and archetype of actions and modulating factors that one has to go through in order to better achieve, increase their probability of success of reaching that goal. So I don't know if that's the most eloquent way of going about it, perhaps a little systematic, but that would probably be my answer to that question.
No, it's all because I ask everyone it, and it's so interesting to hear what everyone defines performance as. Because, for example, when I was talking to my friend that I was running, he's a fighter jet pilot, and when he asked me, I went, "Man, your performance and my performance are 2 different things. What I do is a game. What I do is a game. If our performance, where okay, this was the goal, and then we fall short of it, we go back in the change room, we go back to the gym, we all sit down as coaches." And we analyze and we go, what happened? I go, man, you're a fighter jet pilot. You don't meet that. It's not a game. It's either you did it or you didn't. You don't restart. I was like, very, very different. It's so interesting to hear people
never think about it.
Yeah, in the high performance realm.
Yeah.
How do you define performance? But this one, next one, I'm going to throw this at you. So take your time.
Okay.
What does performance mean for you, Charles Stull, in your life right now?
Well, I'll reuse the logic gate that I just did, right? So performance is the actions necessary to achieve a certain goal. And so if I reflect on that in my life, I think a good metaphor you could use to describe it, I wish to plant trees of which the shade I'll never sit in.
Well, that's epic. That's epic. And that's a good spot. Let's finish that up because that's an epic podcast. I think if you're an MMA fan, you're an MMA fighter, you're a nutritionist, dietitian, whatever, you have anything to do with MMA nutrition, you're going to get a huge amount of info out of that. But there's going to be a lot of people listening to this too, Charles, and they're going to want to reach out to you. They're going to go, man, I need Charles in my life. And I encourage everyone to reach out to you. There's not one single person that I haven't learnt more from. You've probably been the greatest source of probably inspiration for one, and then knowledge. The amount of info I've learnt from you over the years is just, I can't even describe how much. And everyone talks, oh, you've done this with these athletes. I go, well, I kind of just took all that from Charles. Took all that from Charles and repurposed it. Charles, how can these guys reach out? Social media, say if it's a nutritionist, they want to chat to you. If it's an athlete, they want to reach out. What's the best way? Is there an email, social media, website? How's it work?
I mean, I'm decently, you would argue, maybe you might argue otherwise, but I'm decently active on Instagram. So The Angry Dietitian is my social media handle. That's probably the best way to connect with me. But I have a lot of, pretty awesome conversations with up and coming nutritionists or athletes that just need a little guidance, and always happy to, like I said, plant those trees.
And say please and thank you, otherwise you'll unleash the angry dietitian. And
Exactly.
let me tell you, you do not want that in your
Exactly.
life. Charles, I appreciate you taking the time out of the week. I know you're busy. Always a great chat. That's epic. But thanks so much, mate. We'll do it again soon.
Absolutely.